I just want to do a quick mic check. Are we okay? Okay, great. All right. My name is Jen Baldwin. I'm the research specialist for Findmypast, obviously American, so please excuse any mispronunciations of locations. I try really hard. I don't always get it right. But it is lovely to be here with you at Calke Abbey. And we're very excited at Findmypast to be in partnership with the National Trust and to be able to bring some of these incredible stories to life. Our first session this morning starts with the idea of kind of getting into genealogy and how we all start and how this happens, right? How many of you have spent hours and hours at your computer, maybe until like 2 or 3 in the morning? Guilty, totally guilty, right? And it all usually starts at in some capacity with something, right? Some life event that kicks that off. Oral history can be a really crucial part of that process, and of course is a crucial part of human history as a whole. And we all have our stories to tell. Our motivation for investigating our family history could be just about anything, right? General curiosity, perhaps solving a family mystery or legend, exploring this new and exciting and long-term hobby, because it goes on forever, doesn't it? Inheriting all the family stuff, maybe, all the documents and the records and the photographs, or connecting with your heritage or a particular area of history. I was no different. I started the same way. In the United States, it's pretty typical for elementary school students to have an assignment where they interview someone in their family that's older than them. And I interviewed my grandfather. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that he was actually starting down that road of Parkinson's disease. So Grandma sat with us. Now, they lived about a mile from my house, and she was a very stern woman with roots back into Germany. As a young child, I think I was slightly intimidated. But as that conversation continued that day, Grandma and I started to really connect. And she realized that there was something kind of in me, I suppose, that she saw a bit of a spark. Grandma sat in on that conversation, making sure that the facts were accurate. But over the next several years, she would take me on family trips. We would go to cemeteries. We would meet random cousins that I'd never heard of before. And a lifelong journey began. We remained very close and talked about family history for the rest of our lives, or the rest of her life, I should say. But we never talked about her family. We only talked about his. And she was very humbled and almost embarrassed by her own heritage. So it was a privilege and a pleasure for me and an honor to actually tell her story once the moment came. I've been researching my family history since that day. I was about 10 years old when that happened, so I'm not going to tell you how old I am now, but it's been a while, more than 5 years. We all get started somehow, right? And many of us probably have a very similar story to tell. And of course, the people and families here at Calke Abbey are no different. They all have a story to tell. So we're going to start today with a moment captured in time. The Harper Crewe family here at Calke Abbey on the night of the 1921 census of England and Wales. Everybody's heard of the 1921 census? Everybody's so excited about it and happy with it? Yeah, there's a couple smiles out there, that's good. All right, the night of the 1921 census. The household is actually quite full. Now, as William told us, that was somewhat unusual for this point. Sir Von C. Harper Crewe and his wife Isabella are in the later years of their life, at 74 and 67. But the wonderful thing about this census is they actually made mistakes on the document when they filled it out. And you can see those in the relationships. So they initially wrote in everybody as visitor and then crossed that off and put relationships in. Isn't that handy of them? I loved that about this census. It makes it so much easier to figure out who everybody is. We also have notations from the enumerators, right? Circled down here. You can kind of just in green font see that it says both alive when it comes to the grandchildren, meaning their parents are still alive. That was important, obviously, in the 1921 census because we had just gone through the war and the government is trying to understand how many parents are left out there in the country, how many men have lost, or how many children have lost their fathers. So when we take a closer look, a bit of an examination of the 1921 census for this place, for this household, there's a huge number of people in it. There's actually 3 pages worth of people at the estate that night. And that's just the people who were actually in the house. That doesn't include the people who came in as groundskeepers or gardeners and worked and lived elsewhere. Very sad reason, unfortunately, and that's the death of the only son and heir at Calke Abbey, Richard Harper Crewe. He dies just days before the census is taken. It's actually fairly extraordinary. I've been working with the census for the last 3 years, almost every single day, and I can't recall another funeral moment captured in a census record like this. So it's pretty extraordinary to have them all together. Of course, that means that all the family was present, the adult siblings, adult children of the Harper Crewe family. And of course, losing the son and heir is tremendous, right, for the family and the line in and of itself. So Richard's funeral is heavily documented for us in newspaper accounts. Of course, it would be as a member of the family, and we know exactly when and where it took place, and who was present, and how the ceremony proceeded, and every detail that you can imagine is really covered in local newspapers. The newspaper coverage extends well past the funeral. So when we're thinking about doing research on our own family members, we want to be thinking about really broad search terms and making sure that we're looking at all of the possibilities. Both of these newspaper clippings were published 4 and 6 years after his death. So there are memorials being built and significant movements in the neighborhoods and communities in which he lived well after he is deceased. 3 years later, in 1924, Sir Vauncey Harper Crewe also dies, ending the barony, of course, in its final moment. His death and the ramifications of it were also, of course, covered extensively in newspapers, including details of his will and his last wishes. And we're going to look at this article several times today, talking about his will quite a lot. Some of his last wishes included items like how to handle the Calke Abbey seal, his preferences for who can access that item, as well as the keys of the church, and his and his rooms full of exhibits and displays, all of which could only be accessed in the presence of his eldest daughter, Hilda, or her husband. So he was very particular, very protective of not just the family name and the estate, but his collection as well. Now, the newspapers do include right away and tell us right away that his heir becomes Hilda, his eldest daughter. Hilda married in 1918 to Lieutenant Colonel Mosley, who had served in the war and had come home by that point. We learn of the wedding again in great detail thanks to the newspaper collection on Findmypast, including the fact that Hilda wore a veil of old lace belonging to her grandmother. And we can all find marriage registrations and births and deaths, and that is important in genealogical research, thanks to the civil registration process here in the UK. But finding items and mentions of things like heirlooms being worn in a wedding is a very special piece of information, and one that really can only be found in newspapers, or perhaps family memoirs or journals. But from a public record access standpoint, you want to use newspapers to access that information. Hilda also kept a diary, everyday things, and we're incredibly grateful to the team here at Calke Abbey for allowing us to use these images from their archives. She documented the very basic things, doing the laundry, maybe tending to her garden, her 3rd wedding anniversary, which occurred just a few months before the census. In the photograph, it is actually taken from 1935 in a newspaper photo. She's actually crowning the newest Ashby Carnival Queen. Is the Ashby Carnival still happening? Just out of curiosity. Anybody know? It's one of the only photos that's available through the newspaper collection of Hilda, so it makes it actually quite unique and special in that regard. Now, Hilda's diary tells us all sorts of details about the family relationships and how she spent her days. And she clearly spent a lot of time with her brother Richard, whom she refers to as Dick. The family knew that Richard was ill. He'd been ill for some time, so his death was not necessarily a surprise. But even so, in the weeks leading up to his death, they spent a great deal of time with him, taking him around, having meals with him, making sure that he visited other family and friends. And then finally, on the 14th of June, the entry reads, "We were rung up quite early by Arthur Jenny from London to say Richard had passed away in his sleep." And then, of course, we get to the 1921 census, where the family is all found in the home for his funeral. All of the entries in the next several days detail their activities as a family, how they mourned the loss of their brother and son. It's an incredibly moving opportunity to read through these pages and to be able to understand the impact. We can see the impact from a societal standpoint, right? From a cultural standpoint, having a member of a family such as this pass away, ending a barony, right? That's something that is displayed in newspapers and other records. But to have a personal account of these days is quite moving. She talks about how they took flowers, who spoke at the ceremony. She talks about who was at the church and who wasn't. And then, of course, in the days just after the funeral, how she and her mother attend services together and so forth. So while we have this fairly heavy topic captured in the census in this way, we also have this insight into what society and life was like in this part of the country during this period. Of course, an estate like this doesn't just house the family, right? As we've talked about, there are hundreds of people over time who work here, live here, and make this property run. There are an additional 18 people listed as servants in the 1921 census, and many more besides that living nearby and coming to work, if you'll excuse the modern language, commuting essentially into the estate for their daily duties. If we focus in on a couple of them, such as William Daff, who we met earlier, and the housekeeper and cook around him, Harriet and Sarah, we get a lot of detail about each of their lives, their ages by year and month, right? So William Daff isn't just 28 years old, he's 28 years, 6 months, which helps us as researchers identify a more specific birth time. We get his birth location and, of course, his occupation. It's quite unusual at this point for a man of that age to be head butler, and we'll talk a little bit more about William in a minute. It's also interesting to me to interpret records like this, right? So this census was filled out by Sir Harper Crewe, right? So we can assume the head of household fills out the census almost every time. In this instance, he has specifically put Harriet first, and then William, and then Sarah the cook. Now, technically, if you're going by standard traditions, the butler would have been first. He was head of house. He was in charge. He should have been listed first in a very proper way. But in this instance, Harriet is listed first, and that indicates to me at least that the family and the head of household, in this case, Vaughan, put Harriet and William in a more equal position to each other than a senior butler and Harriet as the housekeeper as next in staff. Of course, Harriet is 30 years older than William, so there is some logic to that. But it actually makes you want to sit and kind of think through that in the time that we're talking about, the traditions that we're talking about, the households we're talking about, the way an estate was run at this point in history. There are traditions that are ingrained into these properties. And to break one of those traditions in such a documented manner is noteworthy. Now, it may not mean anything in the long run, but it's something interesting to explore, at least in our imaginations. William Everett Daff, of course, has an interesting life, and he actually finds himself kind of all over the country over the span of his lifetime. But he is a longtime butler, right? He serves out his entire life in domestic service. The tree on Findmypast allows you to put in data and information and organize that information, but also to see it visually, to analyze his life on a map, if you will. Is everybody hearing me okay? Yeah, okay, good. Just getting a few looks from the back row, so I just want to double check. All right. You can see everything outlined for his lifetime on the map and the narrative timeline. It allows you to really explore his experience as a human being, not just as kind of a branch on the family tree. He does, of course, go from here at Calke Abbey in the 1911 census as a hall boy into the Royal Garrison Artillery during the Great War. He actually signs up for the duration of the war, and he's eventually discharged on medical grounds directly from Chelsea Hospital. By the time he was discharged, he had reached the rank of bombardier, and his records indicate both an address in Lincolnshire, where he was born and where his parents were located, and then here at Calke Abbey. They also name a sister, Nellie Daff, as well in the records. Now, we talked a little bit about the seniority of the household. And when you have an ancestor who is a domestic servant, it's kind of important to understand their place in that position. As we mentioned, the butler was considered the highest ranking servant, and he ran the household alongside the housekeeper, but he technically outranked her. So his role of butler would have meant that he oversaw the entirety of the staff, alongside that housekeeper, of course, and he was the face and kind of the representation of the estate and the family, right? Quite literally, when you knocked on the door, he is the face that you saw. But he also would have handled just about everything else that came into the house over time. Now, in 1911, he is a hall boy, so he's at the very bottom of the male line of domestic servants, right? And so in just a decade, he rises up. And we can speculate again as to why that might happen. Maybe it's just circumstance, right? Maybe the war meant that we lost too many men from this part of the country and there were no more experienced butlers in the area to take on that position. Or maybe the family really did respect him that much and elevated him to a much higher rank in a quick amount of time. Typically, that progression would not happen over the course of a decade. So it's quite interesting to see how he kind of enters into that role. Now, again, as the butler, he would have had a huge range of responsibilities, and most of that would have been delegated to his staff. But there are elements of running an estate that I think we don't typically consider when we think about a butler. Maybe a housekeeper, or certainly the female side of the staff. But have you ever considered the impact of renovations to a butler and popularity of different types of decor and furnishings? So in the 1880s through the 1920s, for an example, the arts and crafts movement is quite popular in the UK. And we don't know for sure, at least I don't know for sure, if Calke Abbey participated in that movement. But at this point, it's likely that households across the country were encouraging this type of new wallpaper and furnishings and all of that goes into kind of redecorating a home. William, in his role, would have had to handle such things. He would have been logistics control, essentially, for events like that across a stately home. So when you have someone in domestic service that is in your family tree, you want to be thinking about everything it takes to run that household. Not just what he did every day in terms of answering the door or managing the staff, but actually all of the different elements that go into what that household became. One of the best ways to explore that type of content, of course, and understand what was happening at the house is through newspaper content. Now, I talked about newspapers a lot, I know, but I love them, so I'm going to keep talking about them. And we can see a lot of those kinds of activities covered in local papers. So while William and the household here at Calke Abbey may not have ever experienced the arts and crafts movement as a renovation, we do know that houses kind of all over the country did. And it's worth thinking about that kind of social context, that bigger picture of that environment. As head of staff, he would have also represented the entire group of staff at events such as this one, right? Sadly, another funeral. This time for Miss Alice Georgina Harper Crew in 1920, who was the age of 73. She was a sister to Vaughan. His duties would have extended not just on the property, not just in the home itself, but of course across the community. And that was something that he probably took very seriously. By 1939, William is actually living and employed at Hamswell House in Gloucestershire as a butler. He's now 47 years old and remains single. 1939 registers an incredibly valuable document, not quite a census, but very similar to one, but it does list exact birth dates. So in this case, we know for sure that he provides his birth date as the 20th of November, 1892, and he's also noted as an ARP volunteer. So in my mind, that makes him a contributor and potentially someone we should be very grateful to for both world wars. So the question then becomes, of course, how do you do all of this for yourself? Does everybody have all of this kind of detail in their family tree already? Oh, so we're done. I can just pack it up and go home? Yeah? Okay, good. That's good because I'm kind of tired, so it's fine. Yeah. So let's get started with 5 quick tips. And you actually have these on the little flyers that were on your seats. So again, some of this might be review for some of you who've been doing this for a while. But let's just go through kind of the 5 quick and easy ways to get into your family tree and start to make these discoveries. And the first, of course, is that it all starts with you. I was once a cute little girl I'm not sure what happened, but that is me, about the age I started, just a couple years shy maybe. And really, we want to start by talking about ourselves and thinking about our memories and our understanding of our life, right? When you sit down and think about your grandmother, do you think about her in a third person, or do you think about her as grandmother, right? And what she was like to you is important, but you also need to think about what she was like as a teenager. So we start to write down all of those details, and I recommend that you put them on paper, but then you also put them in, of course, a family tree system, right, to help you stay organized. Once you add your details for yourself, for your parents, siblings, spouses, cousins, then you can start to expand and add new generations as you go. The second opportunity, the second suggestion, is to, of course, to add that family tree information into the Findmypast family tree. We want to make sure that you're utilizing the tools that are provided to you. And today we're grateful and makes it much easier to have kind of these automated tools, right? It's certainly better than the pedigree charts I used to write out by hand and then lose and then have to start over again. So having your tree in one place is a good idea. As your family tree starts to grow, we'll show you clues to your past using Findmypast hints. They are one of the quickest and easiest ways to get back into your family's history. Now, some of you may have big opinions about hints. That's okay. Yeah, I do too. But with systems in place like the GRO system here in the UK or parish records, they are a fairly reliable clue to your family history. I would never suggest that you accept every hint blindly. I will always recommend that you analyze what it is presenting to you and then make a decision for yourself. No computer will ever know your family history better than you do. But the computer can be your friend, and it can be a guide, it can be a tool in your toolkit to help you move back further and further. Because the interesting bit is not necessarily what day they were born. The interesting bit is what was happening around that day, right? That's the part we want to get to. It's the stories that are so fascinating. So allow the system to help you and consider hints as an opportunity, one that should be part of your toolbox. Now on Findmypast, we obviously try to make that as easy as possible, taking something from a hint in your family tree directly into the records so you can analyze for yourself what it is exactly that we're sharing with you. And then from there, of course, you get to start playing detective and be Sherlock Holmes in your own living room. Does anybody have one of the hats, like a Sherlock Holmes hat? I totally have one. Everybody should get a Sherlock Holmes hat. It's really fun. Okay, from here we get to start working in the 1921 census, church records, military documents, and so forth that really allow you to get to those details that you really won't find anywhere else except for in those original records, right? So we can access millions of records on any device, whether it's at home on your computer or on your phone, on your app, on your tablet in front of the television. From here, you get the chance to explore all of these different, wonderful, beautiful historical records. And then, of course, we want to get into newspapers, right? So that's hint number 4, suggestion number 4. Our historic newspaper collection are packed with incredible color. And if you are from this particular county, we actually have newspapers dating as far back as the early 1700s for Derby and moving all the way through modern day. So you have an extensive collection of newspaper content right here in Derby to explore for maybe pictures and stories of your childhood as well as your ancestors. Has anybody found themselves in our newspaper collection? A couple, excellent, fabulous. Newspaper collections allow you to get into just about every kind of detail you can imagine, whether it's major life events or stories of war, but also events around religious services or different denominations. What movie was coming to town? What was playing in the cinema? Which pub had closed or maybe reopened? And what was happening at those locations? Everything from the Women's Institute and their impact to the Red Cross. All of those different kinds of activities can be covered in newspapers. They're really, really fascinating. And then, of course, our last suggestion is to make some new connections. Now, look around the room here. We are all here because we're interested in family history and we're probably interested in this part of the country. So looking around the room today and introducing yourself to a fellow genealogist is actually a great way to start your kind of networking and building that connection. But we also invite you to join us on social media. The Findmypast community is a thriving one with thousands of friendly and knowledgeable family history fans just like yourselves. You'll find us on all the major social media channels. Specifically on Facebook, you'll find the Findmypast forum, which is where people such as you and I get to share our stories, our discoveries, and ask questions. I was supposed to click and I forgot. So there you go. All right, so let's recap really quickly what we've talked about this morning. Start with yourself, your memories, your immediate family, write it all down, and of course, add it to your Findmypast tree. Utilize hints to continue building your tree one step at a time, utilizing the system as a tool, not a hindrance. Investigate those historical records that we all love, right? The 1921 Census and newspapers for stories of everyday life. And of course, we invite you to join the community when you get home to your devices and decide you have a question or a story to tell. That's a great way to do it. So, and think about, again, our main question of the day is, where will your past take you? And we would love to hear your stories as well. So as you are exploring today and learning today with us, we would invite you to engage with any one of the staff members. You can see them through their Findmypast lanyard, and invite you to tell us your stories as well. Because we aren't individuals, right? We live this life on this planet as one giant family of humans, and we all connect with each other. The people at Calke Abbey, the people in the UK, the people around the world all have a unique story, and yours is just as important as anybody else's. Thank you very much for coming this morning. We'll do our next session starting at 11:25, but until then, we invite you to work on the computers on the other side and engage with our team. Thank you very much.